Hello, Alex here, and today we're going to talk about the Pentax 135mm f4 macro lens for the Pentax 6-7 system. Let's get into it. Let's start off with an overview of the lens itself. The lens is 95mm long and 92mm wide at the mount, but it does taper in quite a bit towards the front of the lens, so it isn't quite as thick as it actually sounds. The lens will attach to any of the 4 Pentax 6-7 or 6x7 cameras using the inner bayonet. The lens has a front filter diameter of 67mm, so filters are readily available and pretty cheap. Naked, the lens weighs in at 619 grams, and with the front and rear caps attached, it comes in at 657 grams. So it's decently heavy, but not over the top. This is a prime lens, so it does not zoom, and it has a fixed focal length of 135mm. When mounted to a 6x7 format camera, it has a field of view diagonally equivalent to a 68mm lens attached to a 35mm full frame camera. But in terms of the vertical field of view, which you should be using in my opinion, it comes in more like a 58mm lens, so it's more like a long standard to short telephoto lens. I picked up my copy of the lens for €300, obviously used, not new. The lens's aperture ranges from f4 down to f32. There are half-stop clicks between f5.6 and f22, but weirdly, from f4 to f5.6 and f22 to f32, so on both extreme ends of the aperture range, you only get a single full stop click. The aperture itself is comprised of 8 nearly straight blades, which give octagonal out of focus highlights. The maximum aperture of f4 isn't mind-blowing by any means, but it's pretty decent for a 6x7 medium format macro lens, and in general, it's pretty okay for a short telephoto medium format lens at all. It's on the slower end compared to a lot of offerings, but they don't focus as closely. You always get this kind of a compromise. f4 is decent enough though, and you can get a good bright viewfinder for focusing and composing. Speaking of focusing, the lens can focus down to just 75 centimeters, which gives you magnification and reproduction ratios of 0.3x and 1:3-ish. So while it isn't a true macro lens in the strict sense, it's close enough. It's one of the closest lenses in the system. I believe it gets closer natively than the 100mm macro lens for this system. But if you do attach it to all 3 extension tubes, numbers 1, 2, and 3, at the same time, you do get down to 1:1 life-size reproduction ratio, as I explored in my previous video on medium format macro photography. As with all Pentax 6-7 lenses, this is a manual focus only lens with no autofocus. The overall focus throw is a tremendous 270 degrees from minimum focus distance to infinity, which ensures accurate focusing no matter where you are in the range. When you focus from infinity down towards closer focusing distances, the lens does extend significantly. I haven't noticed any issues with field curvature, flare, ghosting, or chromatic aberration while using this lens, at least natively. When you use the macro extension tubes or diopter filters, it does get a bit worse, as I went through in that previous video, but when it's used normally on its own, it's completely fine and there are no issues whatsoever. Additionally, the centering of my copy is absolutely perfect. Obviously, the ability to focus so closely is a huge boon to this lens. Whether you're taking pictures of objects or just doing portraiture, the ability to focus so closely, depending on your style, can be a really useful tool. Compared to something like the 105mm f2.4, this can focus significantly more closely and has a longer focal length, so you can get a much more intimate portrait despite the longer focal length just by being able to get a lot closer. Secondly, the focus throw. Although I already mentioned that it is about 270 degrees from infinity to minimum focusing distance, infinity to just 1 meter, which is a pretty normal, like everyday range, is still over 160 degrees, maybe 165, 170. That's really good, so it's really easy to get accurate focusing at any distance. A lot of macro lenses on other formats will struggle with their focusing accuracy at longer distances because they prioritize or bias their focus throw towards macro distances. So being able to get a good focus throw no matter where you are is a real benefit of this lens. Thirdly, the sharpness is pretty good from wide open. Here's a shot taken at f4 and I have no complaints with it whatsoever. When you stop down, it just gets better. It goes from very good to excellent. Additionally, because we're dealing with a 6x7 camera, the actual physical diameter of the aperture is quite large. So even at f32 and at macro focusing distances, diffraction isn't as bad as you would think. All in all, this is an excellent performance in this regard. Next, the out of focus rendering is absolutely beautiful. Although f4 isn't the craziest maximum aperture you'll find on a 6x7 system, it is very nice in terms of its rendering. I think the lens makes the most of its f4 aperture, if you want to put it that way. Lastly, the lens uses the very common and affordable 67mm filter thread, which also means you can share filters with most other 6x7 lenses within this lineup. Firstly, the f4 maximum aperture. While it's great for taking pictures at pretty short distances, if you want that medium format, large format look, you know, the Brennizer method kind of look, where you have a very shallow depth of field from far away, this lens isn't going to do that for you. You really want to be looking at the legendary 105mm f2.4 if that's your jam. Secondly, because this is a macro lens, you can obviously focus very closely. This has an impact on your light transmission, which means that if you aren't using the TTL prism, you do have to be mindful of the extension factor, which is about 0.8 stops. Just add a stop when you're focusing at close distances. That said, I have admittedly completely forgotten to compensate for that in the past, and even with consumer color negative film like Ultramax, it still turned out okay. But if you want to shoot slide film or just get the most out of your film, you do have to bear this in mind. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this video where I reviewed the Pentax 135mm f4 macro lens for the 6x7 system. I don't regret buying this lens whatsoever. It's been an absolute joy to use and it's one of the kind of underrated lenses in the system, I would say. If you want to shoot portraits or still lives at close distances, I think this is an easy choice. Your choices are realistically the 100mm macro, which is less readily available and more expensive than this lens, or the 90mm f2.8. The non-leaf shutter version can focus quite close, not as close as this. I think it goes to like 0.2, 0.25, you know, 1:4, 1:5, not as close, but you do gain f2.8 maximum aperture and a wider field of view if that's what you're into. Again, if you want big bokeh from very far away, you're gonna have to go and shell out the cash for the 105mm f2.4. If you like this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon where the tiers start at just €1 per month. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every single day. Lastly, we're going to wrap this one up with more pictures taken with this lens. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye for now.